It was supposed to be a normal, forgettable day. Inside a quiet grocery store, customers moved through the aisles, grabbing milk, bread, and everyday essentials. Among them was Steven Seagal, dressed casually in a hoodie, jeans, and a cap pulled low. No bodyguards. No cameras. Just another man shopping alone. Steven wasn't drawing attention to himself. He wasn't acting like a celebrity. In fact, most people didn't even recognize him. He calmly compared items, checked prices, and placed groceries into his cart like anyone else. But then, something changed. A police officer inside the store noticed him and stopped walking. His eyes stayed locked on Steven for just a little too long. The officer slowly approached, scanning him from head to toe, as if something didn't belong. "Hey you," the cop said sharply. "Where are you going?" Steven looked up, surprised but calm. "I'm just shopping," he replied politely. Instead of walking away, the officer stepped closer. "What's in your bag? Why are you wearing that? Do you have a receipt already?" The questions didn't make sense. Steven hadn't done anything wrong. He wasn't loud. He wasn't suspicious. He was simply standing in a grocery store. Still, Steven kept his voice steady. "No problem, officer," he said calmly. "I'm just buying groceries." But the cop's tone wasn't calm. It was aggressive, sharp, almost accusatory. Nearby shoppers started noticing. A woman paused her cart. A man in the next aisle looked over. Something felt off. This wasn't a normal conversation. This felt like judgment, based on appearance alone. This is how many real-life confrontations begin. Not with violence, not with shouting, but with assumptions. A quiet moment turns uncomfortable when authority forgets fairness. Steven didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He didn't mention who he was. He simply stood there, composed, respectful, and alert. The officer, however, wasn't done. His questions became louder. His posture more intimidating. He stepped closer into Steven's personal space, making it clear he wanted control, not clarity. Around them, phones slowly started coming out. People sensed that this moment might turn into something much bigger. And at that moment, no one inside that store knew what was about to happen next. Have you ever seen someone judged or targeted just because of how they looked? Tell us in the comments. Because this story was only just beginning. The grocery store suddenly felt smaller. What began as a few unnecessary questions had now turned into something heavier, something uncomfortable. The police officer didn't step back. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice growing louder, sharper, more demanding. Steven Seagal stayed exactly where he was. "I already told you," Steven said calmly, his tone respectful. "I'm just shopping." But the officer wasn't listening. "Don't get smart with me," the cop snapped. "Keep your hands where I can see them." People nearby froze. This was no longer a casual interaction. This was authority being exercised without reason. Steven slowly raised his hands, not in fear, but in compliance. His movements were controlled, deliberate. Anyone trained in discipline could see it. He wasn't challenging the officer. He wasn't provoking him. He was trying to de-escalate. This is the moment where many situations either calm down or spiral out of control. When authority feels questioned, even politely, ego can take over. The officer circled slightly, as if trying to assert dominance. "Why are you dressed like this? Where are you coming from? What are you hiding?" The questions were personal, pointless, and humiliating. A man standing nearby whispered to his wife, "This isn't right." Another shopper quietly pulled out their phone and began recording. Steven noticed, but said nothing. He kept his eyes on the officer, breathing slow and steady. Years of training had taught him something most people never learn. Staying calm under pressure is power. But the cop mistook that calm for weakness. "You think you're better than everyone else here," the officer said loudly, making sure others could hear. Steven shook his head. "No, sir," he replied. "I just want to finish my shopping." That answer should have ended it. Instead, the officer's jaw tightened. His voice rose. His body language became more aggressive. He leaned in, invading Steven's personal space, clearly trying to intimidate him into reacting. Around them, the atmosphere shifted. Carts stopped moving. Conversations died mid-sentence. All eyes were now locked on the two men. When bystanders stop shopping and start watching, you know something has gone wrong. This was no longer about safety. This was about control. Steven still didn't reveal who he was. He didn't say his name. He didn't mention movies. He didn't mention martial arts. He let the officer show everyone exactly who he was, without interruption. That's when more phones came out. Quietly, carefully, from different angles. People understood something important. If this went further, proof would matter. And the officer? He didn't notice the cameras. Or maybe he didn't care. He was too focused on asserting authority, on proving that he was in charge. Pause for a second. Tell us in the comments. Which country and city are you watching this from right now? Because stories like this aren't just happening in one place. They're happening everywhere. As the tension inside the grocery store continued to rise, one thing became clear to everyone watching. This situation was heading toward a breaking point. And no one knew how far the officer was willing to go. The tension inside the grocery store was no longer subtle. It was heavy, thick, almost suffocating. The police officer stood uncomfortably close to Steven Seagal, close enough that other shoppers could feel it from a distance. This wasn't about asking questions anymore. This was about intimidation. "Don't move," the officer said sharply. Steven remained still. His hands were visible. His posture was relaxed, but alert. Anyone trained to read body language would recognize it immediately. This was a man exercising extreme self-control. The officer took another step forward. "You hear me?" the cop barked. "I said don't move." Steven met his eyes calmly. "I'm not moving," he replied. "There's no need for this. That should have been enough." Instead, the officer reached out and grabbed Steven's arm. Gasps rippled through the store. A woman near the checkout covered her mouth. Someone near the produce aisle shouted, "Hey! That's not necessary." The situation crossed a line, and everyone felt it. Steven didn't pull away. He didn't react with force. He didn't raise his voice. He slowly turned his head and said, calmly but clearly, "Officer, you're making a mistake. This is the moment most people don't understand. When someone who is fully capable of defending themselves chooses not to, not out of fear, but out of discipline." The officer tightened his grip. "Don't tell me what I'm doing," he snapped. "You're resisting. Resisting." The word echoed in the air, absurd and dangerous at the same time. Phones were now fully raised. No one was hiding it anymore. People were recording openly, their faces tense, knowing that whatever happened next would be impossible to ignore. Steven slowly eased his arm back, not aggressively, not suddenly, just enough to create space. The officer reacted instantly. He shoved Steven backward. Carts rattled. Someone screamed. For a split second, time froze. Everyone expected it. A strike. A throw. A reaction. After all, this was Steven Seagal, a man known worldwide for his martial arts mastery, a man whose entire career was built on control, balance, and devastating efficiency. But instead, Steven exhaled. He planted his feet. And he did nothing. The officer, now visibly agitated, misread that restraint completely. "You think this is funny?" the cop shouted. "You think you're above the law?" Steven shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I believe in the law. That's why I'm staying calm." The crowd went silent. Even the officer paused for half a second, caught off guard by the response. Real power doesn't rush. It waits. And that kind of control can be unsettling to someone who relies on dominance. The officer stepped closer again, chest puffed out, voice raised. "I can take you in right now." Steven looked around, at the people watching, at the phones recording, at the fear on some faces and the anger on others. Then he looked back at the officer. "If you think that's necessary," he said evenly, "then do what you think is right." That calmness only fueled the officer's frustration. His hands shook slightly now. His voice cracked just enough for people to notice. Authority was slipping, and he knew it. A man from the back of the store yelled, "Leave him alone!" Another voice followed. Then another. The crowd was no longer passive. Steven could feel the shift. He could feel the pressure building, not from fear, but from expectation. Pause right here and be honest. Should Steven defend himself in this moment? Or should he stay calm and let it play out? Comment defend or stay calm below. Because what he chose next changed everything. The officer reached for his radio. His hand hovered near his belt. This was the point of no return. Steven straightened his posture, not threatening, not aggressive, but grounded. Solid. Present. He spoke again, calmly, clearly, so everyone could hear. "Officer," he said, "there are cameras everywhere. Please think about what you're doing." That sentence landed hard. The officer looked around for the first time. At the phones. At the crowd. At the witnesses. Doubt flickered across his face. But pride is a powerful thing. Instead of stepping back, the officer doubled down. "Everyone put your phones away," he shouted. No one did. Because by now, this wasn't just about Steven Seagal. It was about fairness. About restraint. About what happens when power is abused in public. And as the tension reached its peak, one thing became clear to everyone watching. This situation could no longer be hidden. And very soon, the truth was going to come out. The grocery store was no longer just a store. It had turned into a stage. After the officer shouted for everyone to put their phones away, and no one listened, something shifted in the air. The balance of power was no longer clear. The crowd wasn't silent anymore, but it wasn't loud either. It was alert. Watchful. And then, the whispers began. A middle-aged man near the frozen foods aisle squinted, leaning slightly to get a better look at the man standing calmly in front of the officer. "Hold on," he murmured to the woman beside him. "Doesn't he look like—" She tilted her head. Looked again. Her eyes widened. "No way," she whispered back. "That can't be him." A few feet away, another shopper quietly pulled up a photo on his phone. He compared it to the man in the hoodie. The beard. The posture. The unmistakable calm. "Oh my God," he breathed. "That's Steven Seagal." The name didn't explode across the store. It traveled slowly. From one person to the next. Like electricity moving through a wire. Steven Seagal. The actor. The martial artist. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Phones adjusted angles. Standing in the center of it all was Steven Seagal himself, still silent, still composed, still refusing to use his identity as a shield. The officer, however, remained completely unaware. Or worse, uninterested. "Don't listen to them," he snapped, noticing the murmurs. "This has nothing to do with who you think he is." Steven didn't respond. He didn't confirm the rumors. He didn't deny them. He didn't say his name. There's a powerful moment when someone realizes they could change everything with a single sentence, and chooses not to. That's restraint most people never experience. The officer mistook Steven's silence for submission. "You want to make this harder for yourself," the cop said. "Keep standing there like you own the place." Steven finally spoke, quietly. "I don't own anything here," he said. "I'm just a customer." The contrast was striking. One man raised his voice to control. The other lowered his voice to calm. A store employee stood frozen near the register, unsure whether to intervene. A manager peeked from behind a display rack, already dialing someone on his phone. Security. Meanwhile, the whispers kept spreading. "That's definitely him. I grew up watching his movies. He teaches Aikido. This guy could hurt him if he wanted to." That last sentence carried weight. The officer heard it. He turned sharply toward the crowd. "Enough," he barked. "Back away." But the crowd didn't move. They weren't being aggressive. They weren't being disrespectful. They were simply standing their ground. Human explanation. When people stop being afraid to watch, authority loses its invisibility. And once it's visible, it's accountable. Steven glanced around the store, not nervously, but thoughtfully. He saw fear in some faces, anger in others, confusion in many, and he knew something important. This was no longer just about him. This was about everyone watching. The officer stepped closer again, lowering his voice this time, trying a different tactic. "You think they're going to protect you," he muttered. "You think fame changes anything?" Steven met his eyes calmly. "No," he said. "But truth does." That response unsettled the officer more than shouting ever could. For the first time, uncertainty crept in. His posture stiffened. His movements became less confident. He glanced around, just briefly, at the cameras pointed his way. The whispers were louder now. Not yelling, not chanting, just constant, unstoppable. Someone near the entrance whispered, "This isn't going to end well for him." And they weren't talking about Steven. There's a moment in every confrontation when the outcome becomes inevitable, even if it hasn't happened yet. This was that moment. Steven still hadn't used his name. Still hadn't raised his voice. Still hadn't moved aggressively. But the truth was moving faster than he ever could. And as store security finally rushed in from the back hallway, everyone knew. The calm before the storm was over. The arrival of store security didn't bring immediate relief. If anything, it made the moment heavier. 2 security guards stood near the aisle entrance, unsure of how to step in. They had seen confrontations before, shoplifters, arguments, even fights, but this was different. The crowd, the cameras, the tension. Everything about this situation felt fragile. The police officer noticed them and straightened his posture instantly. "Good," he said sharply. "I've got a non-compliant individual here." That word again. Non-compliant. Steven Seagal slowly turned his head toward the security guards, then back to the officer. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't fearful. It was disappointed. "I've complied with everything you've asked," Steven said calmly. "I haven't raised my voice. I haven't resisted. And I haven't broken any law." The officer scoffed. "You don't get to decide that." The crowd reacted instantly. "That's not true," someone shouted. "He hasn't done anything." The officer spun toward the voices. "Stay out of this." Steven raised one hand gently, not to silence the crowd, but to calm them. "Please," he said quietly. "Let me speak." The room settled. That alone said everything. There's a rare kind of authority that doesn't come from a badge, a weapon, or a title. It comes from composure. When someone speaks calmly in chaos, people listen, instinctively. Steven turned fully toward the officer now. "Officer," he said, his voice steady but firm, "this isn't about control. It's about respect. And right now, you're not showing any." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. The officer's face tightened. "You're walking a fine line," he snapped. Steven didn't flinch. "No," he replied. "I'm standing on it." A hush fell over the store. Shoppers leaned in slightly. Even the security guards exchanged looks. This wasn't confrontation, it was clarity. Steven continued. "You approached me without cause. You questioned me without reason. You touched me without justification. And now, you're escalating instead of listening." The officer opened his mouth to interrupt. Steven gently raised his hand again. "Let me finish." The confidence in that gesture stopped him. This is the moment when power shifts, not suddenly, not loudly, but unmistakably. When someone speaks truth without fear, the room feels it. Steven gestured lightly toward the phones. "There are witnesses here," he said. "There are cameras. And there is a right way to handle this, and a wrong one." The officer glanced around again. At the crowd. At the recording phones. At the security guards now watching him more closely than Steven. For the first time, his voice wavered. "You don't get special treatment," he said. Steven nodded. "I'm not asking for it," he replied. "I'm asking for the same treatment everyone deserves." That sentence hit the crowd like a wave. A woman near the registers whispered, "That's exactly it." The officer took a step back, not much, but enough for people to notice. His dominance was slipping. He tried again, louder this time. You think talking pretty gets you out of this? Steven met his eyes, unblinking. No, he said. I think accountability does. The silence that followed was deafening. When someone realizes they're being recorded, not just by cameras, but by history, panic often follows. And panic leads to mistakes. The officer's hand moved again toward his belt. Then stopped. His shoulders stiffened. His breathing changed. This wasn't going the way he planned. Steven took a slow breath. I don't want this to end badly, he said. For anyone. That line, quiet, sincere, shifted something deep in the room. The crowd no longer saw a celebrity. They no longer saw a martial artist. They saw a man choosing principle over pride. Security finally stepped forward. Officer, one of the guards said carefully, the manager wants to review the cameras. The officer hesitated. Just for a second. But everyone noticed. Steven didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He didn't say, I told you so. He simply waited. Because he knew something the officer didn't fully grasp yet. The truth had already been recorded. And once cameras start rolling, they don't take sides. They reveal them. The request to review the security cameras changed everything. What had felt like a heated confrontation suddenly became something far more serious, and far more dangerous for the officer. The grocery store manager stood near the service desk, tablet in hand, while one of the security guards gestured toward the back room. Let's just take a look, the manager said carefully. So we're all clear. The officer stiffened. There's no need for that, he replied quickly. I already told you what happened. But no one moved. Not the security guards. Not the manager. Not the crowd. And standing calmly in the center of it all was Steven Seagal, hands relaxed at his sides, expression steady. I have no problem with the footage, Steven said evenly. I welcome it. That sentence alone shifted the balance. When someone isn't afraid of the truth, they don't rush. They wait. And that confidence can be terrifying to someone who knows they crossed a line. The manager tapped the screen. The footage rewound. On the small monitor, the scene replayed from the beginning, clear, wide angle, undeniable. Steven browsing quietly. The officer approaching. The questioning. The escalation. Every unnecessary step. Every raised voice. Every moment of aggression. The crowd leaned forward instinctively, watching the screen even though they had lived it moments earlier. Seeing it from above, objectively, made it worse. A woman whispered, He didn't do anything. The footage continued. The officer stepping into Steven's space. The grabbing of the arm. The shove. The room went silent. No commentary. No excuses. Just evidence. The officer's face drained of color. That's not how it looks, he muttered. But no one responded. Video doesn't argue. It doesn't explain. It doesn't forget. It simply shows what happened, and lets people decide for themselves. At that moment, another police officer entered the store, responding to the earlier radio call. He took one look at the scene, the crowd, the phones, the frozen posture of his colleague, and then his eyes landed on Steven. His expression changed instantly. Wait, he said quietly. Is that? Steven nodded politely. Yes. Recognition spread across the officer's face. Respect followed. The realization hit the first officer like a wave. His shoulders slumped slightly. His jaw tightened. His authority, once loud and absolute, now felt fragile. But Steven didn't say a word. He didn't correct anyone. He didn't smile. He didn't claim victory. He let the truth speak for itself. The second officer turned back to the footage, then to his colleague. Step aside, he said calmly. We need to talk. The crowd reacted, not with cheers, but with relief. Justice was finally entering the room. The most powerful moments aren't loud. They're quiet. They happen when accountability arrives, and ego has nowhere left to hide. The first officer tried to regain control. This is being blown out of proportion, he said weakly. Steven finally spoke again. This isn't about me, he said. It's about how easily this could happen to someone without witnesses, without cameras. That line hit hard. A murmur spread through the crowd, agreement, anger, understanding. The second officer nodded slowly. "We'll handle this," he said. Security stepped back. The manager exhaled. Phones kept recording. And then, something unexpected happened. The first officer looked at Steven. Not with anger. Not with authority. But with fear. Because he knew. This wasn't going away. Be honest. What should happen to this officer now? Comment fired or retrained below. Because your answer says a lot about how you believe justice should work. Steven turned toward the crowd one last time. "I don't want revenge," he said calmly. "I want accountability. So this doesn't happen again." That statement sealed everything. The crowd didn't erupt. They nodded. They understood. As the officer was escorted away from the center of the store, the reality settled in. This moment, captured on security cameras and dozens of phones, was already bigger than this grocery store. It was already spreading. And Steven Seagal? He simply picked up his basket. Because the final chapter of this story wouldn't happen here. It would happen online. In public. In the court of opinion. By the time Steven Seagal walked out of the grocery store, the story had already escaped the building. Videos uploaded minutes earlier were spreading across social media platforms at lightning speed. Different angles. Different perspectives. But the same truth. A calm man. An aggressive officer. And a moment of authority exposed. Within hours, the footage was everywhere. News outlets picked it up first. Then podcasts. Then reaction channels. Headlines appeared across screens around the world. Security camera footage reveals shocking police confrontation. Officer under investigation after grocery store incident. And at the center of it all was Steven Seagal, not throwing a punch, not raising his voice, but standing still while the truth unfolded. In a world obsessed with explosive reactions, restraint feels revolutionary. People weren't shocked because Steven could fight, they were shocked because he didn't. Comments poured in by the millions. This could have been anyone. That's how power should be handled. He showed more discipline than the officer. What resonated most wasn't Steven's fame. It was his choice. He could have ended the situation in seconds. He could have embarrassed the officer physically. He could have walked away using his name. Instead, he stayed. And people noticed. The police department released a statement the next day. Carefully worded. Neutral in tone. But clear in meaning. An internal investigation had been launched. The officer was placed on administrative leave. Body cam footage. Store cameras. Witness videos. All under review. Consequences don't always come instantly, but when evidence is undeniable, they do come eventually. Steven, meanwhile, didn't give interviews right away. He didn't post victory messages. He didn't attack the officer publicly. He didn't demand punishment. When he finally spoke, it was brief. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about how people are treated when no one thinks they're important." That sentence spread just as fast as the video. Because people understood something deeper now. If this could happen to someone famous, someone trained, disciplined, and calm, what happens to people without cameras? Without witnesses? Without a voice? Across the internet, discussions erupted. About profiling. About abuse of authority. About accountability. Teachers shared the video in classrooms. Parents talked about it at dinner tables. Communities debated what real justice looks like. And through it all, Steven stayed quiet. True integrity doesn't chase applause. It lets action speak, and then steps back. Days later, another update came. The officer involved was officially disciplined. Mandatory retraining. Psychological evaluation. Formal reprimand placed on record. For some, it wasn't enough. For others, it was a start. Steven was asked what he thought. He paused before answering. "If it leads to awareness," he said, "then something good came out of it." No anger. No bitterness. Just perspective. The final images from the incident, Steven calmly standing under harsh lights, surrounded by chaos yet untouched by it, became symbolic. Not of celebrity. of choice. Because strength isn't proven when things are easy. It's proven when power is abused, and restraint still wins. This story wasn't about a grocery store. It wasn't about a cop. And it wasn't even about Steven Seagal. It was about dignity. About how we treat people when we think no one is watching, and what happens when they are. If you believe no one should ever be judged by appearance, type respect in the comments. And subscribe for more real-life stories where character matters more than power. Because sometimes, the strongest response is choosing not to strike back.